The artist we're studying today is Georgie O'Keefe. The title for this piece is Ram's Head, White Hollyhock, and Hills. One thing I want you to pay attention to, sometimes artworks have very flowy, sort of, ethereal names, things that you kind of look at it and you're like, why in the world did they name this piece that? But Georgie O'Keefe always plays it real. Her pieces generally have very clear, straightforward titles of, this is what's in the piece here. So certainly your artworks can have the same thing where everything's pretty straightforward. The medium of this piece is an oil painting. The elements that are most important for this piece are color and balance. For color, she has a fairly simple color palette here. There's lots of neutrals where the skull and the mountain range is. The hollyhock is kind of standing out a little bit because it is so bright white, and that yellow is really the only place that it shows up. There's a little bit in the skull, but not as vibrant as in the flower. And then, of course, very large in the background, we have these deep blue looming clouds. And if you're looking at it, it certainly doesn't seem like a bright sunny day going on. And it looks like, there's some storm clouds brewing. Maybe this is, the calm before the storm. For value, obviously, Georgie O'Keefe has done a very good job here using a full value range from 0 all the way to 100%. And she's using shading here too to help things look realistic, and using very nice gradient and going from one color to the next. So that value helps for things to look three-dimensional, even though it's on a two-dimensional painting. The principle that's most important for this piece is balance. If I took some scissors and I cut this piece straight up and down in the middle, it's fairly balanced from left to right. So we would call this piece symmetrical. The only hitch is this flower here on the left. Because it's not mirrored on the right side, that means that it's not purely symmetrical. So this technically has an asymmetrical balance, even though most of it is very well mirrored. The mood for this piece is eerie and calm. So it's a little bit spooky. First off, we're checking out a skull here floating in the sky, which is really weird, right? And usually we're not very used to looking at skulls. Usually those are inside our bodies and the bodies of animals and creatures around us. So, it's sort of this really creepy thing to be looking at a skull in this piece. And I mentioned before as well, those clouds look sort of like the calm right before a storm. So you know that something's brewing and something's about to happen, but it's not a happy sort of calm. The genre for this piece is down here in the bottom right, American Modernism. Georgie O'Keefe was born in 1887 and died in 1986. She was an American painter, and most of her famous works were painted while she lived in New Mexico. And she uses a lot of the imagery that she would see and experience in that area and in her community to show what life was like around her. She concentrated a lot on landscapes, like this one here, and zoomed in still lives. Oriental poppies on the left and calla lily turned away on the right are both still lifes, because we have these objects that aren't alive like a human or an animal. These are very large canvases, but she zooms way, way into that object, or in the case of the piece on the left, 2 objects, and makes these very, very large and concentrates on those very close details of these objects. She also uses a lot of Western imagery in her work. So skulls and bones of cattle, like we saw in the first piece, limestone mountain ranges, and flowers she really enjoyed using in her work. The piece on the left here is a Kachina doll, which is important for Native American communities that are around New Mexico and that area. So she's showing not necessarily something that was part of her particular culture, but something that she experienced and was familiar with because of where she lived. The piece on the right, again, we have this very interesting background of very open mountain range that seems like it would be in a desert, except those colors are very vivid and not realistic. And then there's this very large white shell right in the center. And obviously, this isn't something that would be realistic as far as you're walking in the desert and you see a huge, huge shell that's almost the size of a mountain. So she is taking things that look realistic and changing the way they look and making it not quite realistic by adapting the size or the colors that she's using for those pieces. She would look at this imagery on her walks in the deserts and sometimes would pick items up to take home with her and work in her studio as a reference. So maybe she ran into one of these shells on her walk and brought it back to use as a reference. The cow skull on the very first painting, probably she found that in the desert, took it home, and decided to use it for her artwork. O'Keefe was also described once as having a very prickly personality. So she probably, wasn't very easy to get along with. And, sometimes you have that person that where they don't really necessarily pay attention to their tone, or just seems like sometimes the way they say things can be a little aggravated, right? So I find that a little bit funny.